always from the heart of the city, and now on demand 24/7 on the CHFI website. This is the soundtrack to accompany a graduation. And I'm Don Jackson, around the world on the internet. It is my son's graduation ceremony tonight. It's a milestone as he prepares for high school this September. Louis L'Amour in The Walking Drum, published by Bantam, wrote, "Up to a point, a man's life is shaped by environment, heredity, and changes in the world about him. Then there comes a time when it lies within his grasp to shape his life into the sort of thing he wishes it to be. Only the weak blame parents, their race, their times, lack of good fortune, or the quirks of fate. Everyone has it within his power to say, 'This I am today, that I will be tomorrow.'" This hour, some words of wisdom for all who are graduating this year. From CHFI.com. Whitney Houston with The Greatest Love of All, and John Mayer and No Such Thing. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. Lord Chesterfield wrote, "Knowledge is a comfortable and necessary retreat and shelter for us in an advanced age. And if we do not plant it while young, it will give us no shade when we grow old." Christopher Morley in Travels in Philadelphia, published by David McKay, wrote, "From now until the end of time, no one else will ever see life with my eyes. And I mean to make the most of my chance." This is CHFI.com. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. Eric Clapton to Change the World, the Backstreet Boys with The Shape of My Heart, and Chantal Krevizauk with All I Can Do When Faced with a Crossroads. William Raspberry in the Washington Post wrote, "How well we do is determined not just by our gifts and grit, but also by social background, networks, family connections, and powerfully, by how well our parents did. Life is not merely a foot race, but a relay race. It matters a lot how much headway the previous runner has made when he hands you the baton." And Lynn V. Cheney from The Importance of Stories wrote, and I quote, "People who grow up without a sense of how yesterday has affected today are unlikely to have a strong sense of how today affects tomorrow. It is only when we become conscious of the movement of time that the consequences of action, whether it is taking drugs or dropping out of school, become a consideration. It is only when we have perspective on our lives that motives besides immediate gratification can come into play." Lynn V. Cheney from The Importance of Stories. CHFI.com. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. Natasha, Bedingfield, Unwritten. Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World. And the Beatles with Yesterday. My son's graduation ceremony is tonight. He's about to make a major change in his life. He starts high school in the fall. My daughter has already forged the path, and he will follow, but he will also follow his own dreams. Isabel Moore from Bits and Pieces had an interesting take when she wrote, "Life is a one-way street. No matter how many detours you take, none of them leads back. Once you know and accept that, life becomes much simpler. Because then you know you must do the best you can with what you have and what you are and what you have become." This is CHFI.com. Leanne Womack and I Hope You Dance, and 5 for Fighting with The Riddle. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. This is one of my most favorite stories. It's appropriate for this program. It was written by Elizabeth Silence Ballard. There is a story many years ago of an elementary teacher. Her name was Mrs. Thompson. And as she stood in front of her 5th grade class on the very first day of school, she told the children a lie. Like most teachers, she looked at her students and said that she loved them all the same. But that was impossible, because there, in the front row, slumped in his seat, was a little boy named Teddy Stoddard. Mrs. Thompson had watched Teddy the year before and noticed that he didn't play well with the other children, that his clothes were messy, and that he constantly needed a bath. And Teddy could be unpleasant. It got to the point where Mrs. Thompson would actually take delight in marking his papers with a broad red pen, making bold X's, and then putting a big F at the top of his papers. At the school where Mrs. Thompson taught, she was required to review each child's past records, and she put Teddy's off until last. However, when she reviewed his file, she was in for a surprise. Teddy's 1st grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is a bright child with a ready laugh. He does his work neatly and has good manners. He is a joy to be around." His 2nd grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is an excellent student, well liked by his classmates. But he is troubled because his mother has a terminal illness, and life at home must be a struggle." His 3rd grade teacher wrote, "His mother's death has been hard on him. He tries to do his best, but his father doesn't show much interest, and his home life will soon affect him if some steps aren't taken." Teddy's 4th grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is withdrawn and doesn't show much interest in school. He doesn't have many friends and sometimes sleeps in class." By now, Mrs. Thompson realized the problem, and she was ashamed of herself. She felt even worse when her students bought her Christmas presents, wrapped in beautiful ribbons and bright paper. Except for Teddy's. His present was clumsily wrapped in the heavy brown paper that he got from a grocery bag. Mrs. Thompson took pains to open it in the middle of the other presents. Some of the children started to laugh when she found a rhinestone bracelet with some of the stones missing, and a bottle that was 1/4 full of perfume. But she stifled the children's laughter when she exclaimed how pretty the bracelet was, putting it on and dabbing some of the perfume on her wrist. Teddy Stoddard stayed after school that day just long enough to say, "Mrs. Thompson, today you smelled just like Mom used to." After the children left, she cried for at least an hour. On that very day, she quit teaching, reading and writing, and arithmetic. Instead, she began to teach children. Mrs. Thompson paid particular attention to Teddy. As she worked with him, his mind seemed to come alive. The more she encouraged him, the faster he responded. By the end of the year, Teddy had become one of the smartest children in the class. And despite her lie that she would love all the children the same, Teddy became one of her teacher's pets. A year later, she found a note under her door from Teddy, telling her that she was still the best teacher he ever had in his whole life. 6 years went by before she got another note from Teddy. He then wrote that he had finished high school second in his class, and she was still the best teacher he ever had in his whole life. 4 years after that, she got another letter saying that while things had been tough at times, he'd stayed in school, had stuck with it, and would soon graduate from college with the highest of honors. He assured Mrs. Thompson that she was still the best and favorite teacher he ever had in his whole life. Then, 4 more years passed, and yet another letter came. This time he explained that after he got his bachelor's degree, he decided to go a little further. The letter explained that she was still the best and favorite teacher he ever had. But now his name was a little longer. The letter was signed Theodore F. Stoddard, M.D., unquote. But as the author goes on to say, and again I quote, "But the story doesn't end there," unquote. Its conclusion shortly. I'm Don Jackson from CHFI.com. Bette Midler with The Wind Beneath My Wings and Josh Groban, And You Raise Me Up. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. The conclusion now of this story by Elizabeth Silence Ballard. She goes on to write, "The story doesn't end there. You see, there was yet another letter that spring. Teddy said he'd met this girl and was going to be married. He explained that his father had died a couple of years ago, and he was wondering if Mrs. Thompson might agree to sit in the place at the wedding that was usually reserved for the mother of the groom. Of course, Mrs. Thompson did, and guess what? She wore that bracelet, the one with several rhinestones missing, and she made sure she was wearing the perfume that Teddy remembered his mother wearing on their last Christmas together. They hugged each other, and Dr. Stoddard whispered in Mrs. Thompson's ear, 'Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for believing in me. Thank you so much for making me feel important and showing me that I could make a difference.' Mrs. Thompson, with tears in her eyes, whispered back. She said, 'Teddy, you have it all wrong. You were the one who taught me that I could make a difference. I didn't know how to teach until I met you.'" Unquote. Elizabeth Silence Ballard. A story about Teddy. I began the hour with John Mayer. I thought it appropriate to feature one more by him. I'm Don Jackson from CHFI.com. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.